The bell at the Dust Haven post station rang 3 times, each clang swallowed by the wind before it could travel much farther than the general store. The sound was thin and desperate, a metal tongue trying to speak against a mouth full of dust. From the doorway of the temporary boarding house, Abigail Whitlock watched the red powder swirl in the street, coating everything in a fine layer of rust. It settled on the sweat of the horses tied to the hitching posts and on the brims of the hats of the few men who braved the open. The dust was a constant companion in this part of the Arizona Territory, a reminder that the land was patient and would eventually reclaim everything built upon it. It had been 3 weeks since she arrived, 3 weeks of the same relentless sun, the same wind, and the same silence from her brother, Eli. She had come to Dust Haven following the last letter she had received, a letter full of his usual optimism about the great iron artery of the railroad that would pump life into this forgotten corner of the world. He was a worker on that line, a man who believed in progress and the solid feel of a well-swung hammer. But the letters had stopped, and Abigail, a woman who believed in facts and the steady beat of a living heart, had come to find her own answers. She was a teacher by trade and a nurse by necessity, skills she had hoped would make her useful here. So far, her primary skill had been waiting. She waited for the stagecoach, hoping for a letter. She waited for the railroad foreman, a man named Barnaby Pike, to grant her a moment of his time. She waited for a familiar face in the crowd, for the sight of her brother's easy walk and lopsided grin. The town itself seemed to be waiting too, holding its breath under the vast, indifferent sky. It was a place of sharp edges and sharper tensions, a fragile collection of wooden buildings huddled between the sprawling cattle ranches and the raw, unfinished gash of the new rail line. Here, ranchers and railroad men drank at the same saloon with a suspicion that was thicker than the whiskey. Cavalry patrols passed through with eyes that saw everything and said nothing, and the whispers about the Apache, the Chiricahua who had been pushed from these lands but not broken, were as constant as the wind. Miles away, Nietzsche's heard no bell. The only sounds were the whisper of that same wind through the scrubby junipers and the gentle, life-giving gurgle of water over stones. He stood in the cool shade of a narrow canyon, a place his people had known for generations. This was the spring of the ancestors, a sacred place where the water ran sweet and cold even in the driest seasons. It was the heart of their land, and his heart ached to see the railroad surveyor's stakes driven into the ground less than a mile away. He was a quiet man, carrying the weight of a warrior's legacy and the fresh sorrow of a displaced people. The old ways were fading, scattered like ashes by the American advance. His duty, as he saw it, was to protect what little remained, and this spring was everything. He knelt, cupping his hands to drink. The water was a prayer, a connection to his father, his grandfather, and all who had come before. They had fought for this land, bled for it. Now, the fight was quieter but no less desperate. It was a fight against fences, against iron tracks, against the endless thirst of the newcomers who saw the land not as a mother to be respected, but as a thing to be conquered and consumed. He had seen the way they looked at the spring, their eyes calculating gallons and dollars. The railroad needed water for its steam engines, and the cattle barons needed it for their herds. They did not see the spirits that dwelled here. They saw only a resource waiting to be exploited. His purpose was simple and unyielding. He would not let them kill this place. He would not let them turn his people's heart to dust. The news of the supply wagon reached Dust Haven just before noon. It came with a lone rider, his face pale beneath a layer of that ever-present red dust. He nearly fell from his horse at the sheriff's office, his words tumbling out in a panicked rush. "Robbed," he said. The wagon carrying payroll and supplies for the railroad camp had been ambushed 10 miles east of town. The 2 guards were gone, and the entire wagon had been cleaned out. Before Sheriff Doyle could even ask the important questions, the story had already written itself in the minds of the townspeople gathering in the street. A rancher, his face hard and weathered as old leather, declared it was the Apache. It had to be. The storekeeper, a nervous man who polished his counter compulsively, nodded in agreement, adding that no decent folk would commit such an act. The blame spread through the town like a grass fire, fanned by old fears and fresh resentment. The Chiricahua were the specters that haunted this territory, the convenient explanation for every misfortune, from a spooked herd to a dry well. Abigail heard the commotion from the boarding house. She stood in the street with the others, listening to the rising anger. A detail in the rider's frantic story snagged her attention. He mentioned the attackers had been swift and silent, leaving almost no trail. But he also said he had found a strange boot print near the scene, one with a worn-down heel and a star-shaped mark he did not recognize. And there was something else, a glint of metal in the dirt that looked like a button from a cavalryman's coat. The crowd ignored these details. They had the story they wanted, the one that was simple and satisfying. It was the Indians. Her stomach tightened. Eli worked on that line. He was supposed to have been on that supply run, helping to inventory the goods. A cold dread, far more chilling than the desert night, began to seep into her bones. The official story did not feel right. It was too neat, too easy. She knew her brother. He was observant. And he had written to her about tensions within the railroad camp itself, about arguments over water rights and rumors of skimming from the payroll. Eli was a man who looked for the truth, even when it was inconvenient. It was a quality that often got him into trouble. Her own goal, once as simple as finding her brother, now sharpened with a new urgency. She had to find the truth of what happened to that wagon, for Eli's sake. And as she looked at the faces in the crowd, twisted with fear and a thirst for vengeance, another purpose began to form in her heart. She saw the children on the edges of the crowd, the pale, freckled sons of the ranchers, the dark-eyed children of the Mexican railroad workers, and even a few shy Apache children who lived in a small, tolerated settlement on the edge of town. They all watched their parents, their young faces reflecting the same ugly emotions. This was a poison, she realized, and it was being fed to them every day. She had come here to teach reading and arithmetic, but she saw now that there was a more important lesson to be taught. It was a lesson in looking past the surface of things, in asking questions instead of accepting easy answers. She would start her school, not in a proper building, for there was none to be had, but anywhere she could gather a few students. A barn, a church, basement, even the shade of a scraggly mesquite tree. She would teach them their letters. Yes, but she would also teach them to see each other not as categories or enemies, but simply as people. It was a small goal, perhaps, a tiny, flickering candle against a great darkness. But it was a start. It was something to build in a place that seemed intent on tearing things down. The sun began its slow descent, painting the red canyons in shades of orange and purple. The fierce heat of the day gave way to a sudden, biting chill. It was another feature of this land of extremes. In her small, plain room at the boarding house, Abigail lit a lamp. The yellow light pushed back the shadows, creating a small circle of warmth and civilization. She took out the last letter from Eli, its creases worn soft from countless readings. She traced his familiar, messy handwriting, searching for clues she might have missed, for some hint of the danger he might have been in. His words were full of life, describing the beauty of a desert sunrise and the camaraderie of the work crews. But reading it now, with the town's angry shouts still echoing in her ears, a shadow seemed to fall over the cheerful words. From a ridge overlooking the darkening town, Naiches watched the lights flicker on one by one. He had seen the rider arrive. He had seen the angry mob form. He knew what it meant. The stolen payroll was a stone thrown into a still pond, and the ripples would reach his people. It did not matter who had actually robbed the wagon. In this territory, there was only one suspect for such a crime. He felt a familiar, weary anger. It was a burden he had carried his entire life, the need to be constantly on guard, to anticipate the false accusations, to defend against a hatred that was as shapeless and persistent as the dust. His fight for the spring had just become infinitely more complicated. Now he had to protect his people not just from the slow theft of their water, but from the swift injustice of a rope. The wind picked up, moaning through the rocks around him. He pulled his thin blanket tighter, his gaze fixed on the small cluster of lights that represented the world that was slowly strangling his own. Down there, in one of those rooms, a woman he had never met was reading a letter from her brother, her heart filled with a quiet fear. And out here, under a blanket of brilliant, cold stars, a man she had been taught to fear was saying a silent prayer for the one thing they both desperately needed: the truth. The post station bell was silent now. The town of Dusthaven settled into an uneasy night, unaware that the real storm had not yet begun. The day after the robbery, Sheriff Doyle returned to town not with prisoners, but with a canvas sack of grim artifacts. He emptied its contents onto his dusty desk: a spent rifle cartridge of an unusual caliber, a single horseshoe that was clearly not from an Apache pony, but from a large, shod workhorse, and a small, leather-bound book, its cover scorched and its pages fused together by heat and what looked like spilled whiskey. Tucked inside the charred cover was a single folded paper, miraculously spared from the worst of the flames. It was a letter, addressed in a familiar scrawl to Miss Abigail Whitlock, Dusthaven. The sheriff, a man whose weary face showed the constant strain of balancing law and local opinion, sent a deputy to fetch her. When Abigail saw the scorched letter, her breath caught in her throat. It was Eli's handwriting. Her hands trembled as she took it. The paper was brittle, and the edges crumbled to ash as she unfolded it. Much of the writing was lost to the fire, but a few lines, written near the bottom of the page, were still legible. The words seemed to leap out at her. A voice from the ashes. "If you are reading this," it said, "believe that the robbers were not Apache." The words were a confirmation of the doubt that had been coiling in her gut. Eli had seen something. He knew something, and for him to write such a specific warning meant he feared the truth would be buried under the town's convenient prejudice. The letter was not a comfort. It was a terrifying responsibility. The truth was out there, but it was being deliberately hidden, and her brother was caught in the middle of it. That same afternoon, Naiches was tracking a small herd of pronghorn antelope near the base of the Red Mesas when he heard the cry. It was faint, the sound of a child in pain. He followed the sound to a shallow arroyo, where a boy of no more than 10 years lay beside an overturned rock. The boy, a mestizo child whose family worked a small, hardscrabble farm a few miles away, had a badly broken leg. His face was pale with shock and pain. He had been chasing a runaway goat, he explained in a mixture of Spanish and English, and had stumbled, the rock pinning his leg. Naiches said little. He examined the leg with the practiced, gentle hands of a man who understood wounds. The bone was broken cleanly, but the boy was weak from exposure and thirst. Leaving him here was not an option. The sun was a merciless hammer in the sky, and the coyotes would be bold after dusk. With great care, Naiches splinted the leg using strips of his own shirt and 2 straight branches of greasewood. Then, he lifted the boy into his arms. The child was light, a fragile weight against his chest. Dusthaven was the closest place with anything resembling a doctor, and it was in that direction that Naiches began the slow, careful walk. He was still 2 miles from the town when the riders saw him. They were ranchers, their faces hard under the brims of their hats, their rifles resting easy in their saddle scabbards. They had been out searching, not for a lost boy, but for any sign of the Apache raiders they were so certain had committed the robbery. When they saw Naiches, a Chiricahua warrior, carrying a limp child, their minds saw only one thing: a predator and his victim. They spurred their horses, circling him, their voices a low, angry growl. "What have you done to the boy?" Apache one of them demanded, his hand moving to his pistol. Naiches did not stop walking. He held the boy tighter. "His leg is broken," he said, his voice calm and even. "He needs a doctor." They did not believe him. They saw his torn shirt and took it as a sign of a struggle. They saw the boy's pale, fearful face and mistook his pain for terror of his rescuer. The circle of riders tightened, their anger building into a palpable wave of violence. They forced him to a halt, their horses jostling him, their faces a mask of suspicion and hate. It was then that Abigail arrived. She had been walking the edge of town, the scorched letter clutched in her hand, her mind racing with 100 desperate plans. She was on her way to confront the railroad foreman, Barnaby Pike, when she saw the cluster of riders and heard their angry shouts. Her heart leaped into her throat when she saw the Apache man at the center of the circle, holding a child. But where the ranchers saw a kidnapper, Abigail, with her nurse's eyes, saw something else entirely. She saw the careful way the man held the boy, his arms cradling the injured leg. She saw the makeshift splint, crude but effective. And she saw the boy's face, not terrified of the man holding him, but exhausted and in agony. "Stop!" Her voice was sharp, cutting through the angry murmurs. She pushed her way through the horses, her gaze fixed on the injured child. "Can you not see that boy needs help? His leg is broken." One of the ranchers spat on the ground. "He is the one who broke it. Most likely, we found him with the boy." "You found him carrying the boy toward town," Abigail corrected, her voice losing none of its authority. "Toward help. Look at that splint. Does that look like the work of a man who means to harm a child?" Her words planted a small seed of doubt. The men looked from her to Naiches, their certainty wavering for the first time. Just then, Sheriff Doyle rode up, drawn by the commotion. He took in the scene with a practiced, weary eye, the armed ranchers, the defiant teacher, and the silent Apache warrior holding an injured boy. Before the sheriff could speak, a new figure pushed his way to the front. He was a big man with a florid face and a long, drooping mustache. He wore 2 pistols tied low on his hips and a silver star pinned to his vest, though it was not a star any of them recognized. "No need for a long debate." "Sheriff," the man said, his voice a smooth, dangerous drawl. "This is Judd Crow. I have a reputation for settling these matters quickly. The town wants justice for that robbery, and here is your man. Let us hang him now and save everyone the trouble of a trial." The bounty hunter's words were like gasoline on a fire. The crowd's anger, which had momentarily subsided, flared anew. "He is right," someone shouted. "String him up." Sheriff Doyle held up a hand. He looked at Naiches, then at the boy, and finally at Abigail. He was a man caught in a vice, squeezed between the pressure of the mob and the letter of the law. "There will be no hanging," he said, his voice tight. "But I am taking him in for questioning. He was found with the boy, and he will answer for it." He dismounted and took the child from Naiches' arms. "You men, give me a hand here. Let us get this boy to the doctor's office." As the ranchers dismounted to help, their attention shifted to the child. Judd Crow shot Naiches a look of pure venom. The sheriff put a hand on Naiches' shoulder. "You will come with me." Naiches offered no resistance. He met the bounty hunter's gaze with a look of cold, unyielding pride, and then he turned and walked beside the sheriff, his head held high, toward the town jail. Later, in the cramped, stifling heat of the sheriff's office, Abigail made her plea. The doctor had set the boy's leg and confirmed his story, but the town, egged on by Judd Crow, was still convinced of Naiches' guilt in the robbery. They wanted a scapegoat, and he was the one they had found. "He has a deep cut on his arm." "Sheriff," Abigail said, her tone reasonable and calm, "from the struggle with those ranchers. I imagine it needs to be cleaned and stitched, or it will fester in this heat. A dead prisoner cannot answer any of your questions." Sheriff Doyle sighed, running a hand over his face. "And I suppose you are volunteering for the job?" "I am," she said, "in exchange for a favor." He raised an eyebrow. "A favor? Let me use the back room of the church for a school." She said, "It is empty most of the week. I want to teach the children. All of them. It will keep them out of trouble." and it will give this town something to think about besides vengeance." The sheriff looked at her for a long moment, a flicker of something like respect in his tired eyes. It was a strange bargain, but in a town like Dusthaven, it made a certain kind of sense. "All right, Miss Whitlock," he said finally, "you can have the church. Go and patch up your prisoner, but be careful. He is a wild man, for all his silence." The jail consisted of 2 small cells at the back of the office. The air was thick with the smell of stale sweat and despair. Naiches sat on the edge of the narrow cot, his back straight, his hands resting on his knees. He watched her approach with dark, unreadable eyes. There was no fear in them, only a profound, deep-seated stillness, like a mountain waiting for a storm. Abigail carried a small basin of water and a cloth bag with her nursing supplies. She did not speak at first, simply setting her things down on a small stool. The sheriff unlocked the cell door and then, with a nod to her, retreated to his office, leaving them alone. She knelt and began to clean the gash on his forearm. It was a nasty cut, deep and crusted with dirt and dried blood. He did not flinch as she worked, his muscles remaining perfectly still under her touch. This was the first time they had been this close, and she was struck by the quiet dignity of his presence. He was not the savage of the town's imagination. He was a man, and a man who had been wronged. As she carefully stitched the wound, her thoughts returned to her brother. The burned letter felt like a weight in her pocket. Eli's words echoed in her mind. Believe that the robbers were not Apache. She thought of the star-shaped boot print, the cavalry button, the shod horse. She thought of the town's blind rage, and the smooth, cruel words of the bounty hunter. It was all a lie, a carefully constructed deception, and this man, this silent warrior, was about to pay the price for it. Without realizing she was speaking aloud, she murmured to herself, her voice barely a whisper, "If Eli was right, the thing that needs to end is the lying." His head turned slightly. His dark eyes met hers, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something in their depths. It was not gratitude, not yet. It was not warmth. It was a sharp, sudden gleam of understanding. He had heard her. He had understood. In that moment, a silent, fragile connection was forged in the dim light of the jail cell. It was not the spark of romance or a sudden, dramatic revelation. It was something quieter, and perhaps stronger. It was the first tentative thread of a shared purpose, a mutual recognition between 2 strangers who had both been thrust into the center of a dangerous falsehood. She was a teacher who sought facts, and he was a warrior who defended his truth, and they both knew, with a certainty that needed no words, that their paths were now intertwined. A thin, delicate strand of trust had been spun in a town built on lies. Whether it would hold or snap under the coming strain, neither of them could say. Sheriff Doyle kept Naiches in the jail for 2 more days. It was not for justice, but for protection. The mood in Dusthaven was a foul, simmering thing, and Judd Crow spent his time in the saloon, his smooth voice oiling the gears of hatred, buying drinks and telling stories of other towns that had solved their Indian problems with a strong rope and a tall tree. On the 3rd morning, with the boy's family having confirmed the story of the broken leg and the rescue, the sheriff had no choice. He unlocked the cell door. "You are free to go," he said, his voice low. "I would advise you to be gone from this area for a while, for your own safety." Naiches rose from the cot, his movements fluid and deliberate. He looked at the sheriff, his gaze holding no gratitude, only a clear, cold assessment. "This is my home," he said, the words simple and final. He walked out of the office and into the harsh morning light, never looking back. Abigail had already begun her own investigation. She went to the railroad camp office, a temporary wooden shack filled with the smells of sweat, ink, and sawdust. Barnaby Pike, the foreman, was a man whose body seemed to be made of soft, round shapes. but whose eyes were small and hard as pebbles. He offered her a slick, practiced sympathy for her missing brother. "A tragedy, Miss Whitlock, a true tragedy," he said, steepling his fleshy fingers. "Eli was a fine worker. We are all hoping for the best." "I would like to see the company's payroll ledger," Abigail said, her tone polite but firm. "And any of my brother's work assignments for the last month." Pike's smile tightened. "I am afraid that is confidential company information. We cannot simply show our books to every concerned relative. My brother's letter, the one found at the robbery site, suggests he knew something about the attack," she said, watching his face carefully. "It suggests the attackers were not Apache? I believe his work records might tell me what he knew." The foreman's eyes went colder. "Your brother was a laborer, Miss Whitlock, not a detective. He hammered spikes. Now, if you will excuse me, I have a railroad to build." He turned away, a clear dismissal. But in that moment, his attention was caught by a clerk who hurried in with a question. As Pike was distracted, Abigail's eyes scanned his desk. A large map was unrolled, held down by inkwells. It showed the planned route of the railroad, but there was another line on it, a thin blue one, drawn in a different ink. It branched off from the main line and led directly toward a part of the territory marked only with rough drawings of canyons. It ran straight through the area Naichi's people claimed as their own, and scrawled next to the blue line were figures and notes about water pressure and pipeline construction. Before Pike turned back, she had committed the map's details to memory. She found Naichi sitting in the thin shade of the livery stable, methodically sharpening a knife on a whetstone. He looked up as she approached, his hands never ceasing their rhythmic work. She sat on an overturned bucket a respectful distance away. "They are planning to take your water," she said without preamble. "I saw a map. A pipeline." He did not seem surprised. He finished sharpening the blade and tested its edge with his thumb. "Our ancestors knew this day would come," he said, his voice as dry and devoid of emotion as a military report. "At the heart of the spring, there is a circle of stones, one for each generation of chiefs. Each one placed a hand on the stone of his father and swore an oath to protect the water. It is not a story for songs. It is a duty. The water is the life of the people. If the water dies, we die." He slipped the knife into its sheath. "It is that simple." "My brother knew," she said. "I think he found out about the pipeline, and I think that is why he is missing. The men who want the water would not want him to speak of it." Naiches agreed. "We need proof," she said. "Proof that the robbery was a lie to cover up the truth." He stood. "Come." He led her out of town. Following a dry wash that snaked its way toward the mesas, he moved with an economy of motion that made the difficult terrain seem easy. They walked for an hour until they reached a place where the earth was scarred with the tracks of heavy wagons. The same tracks she had heard the supply wagon rider describe. Naiches knelt, pointing to the ground. There were dark, sticky patches on the rocks, glistening in the sun. "Tar," he said, "to seal pipes." A few feet away, he picked up a small, jagged piece of rock. He held it to her nose. The sharp, acrid smell of blasting powder still clung to it. "They use this to break the rock for the railroad." He said, "It is not the weapon of an Apache. We do not carry the earth's fire in our hands." The evidence was clear. A story written on the land itself. Someone with access to railroad supplies had staged the robbery. Someone who wanted the land, the water, and an excuse to drive the Apache away for good. As they walked back toward Dust Haven, Sheriff Doyle rode out to meet them. He tipped his hat to Abigail, his gaze lingering on Naiches with a complicated mixture of suspicion and reluctant respect. "I have been watching your friend, Judd Crow," the sheriff said, his voice a low rumble. "He spends his nights drinking with Pike at the saloon. They talk quiet, but they look like two coyotes planning to raid a henhouse. Something is not right about any of this." He shook his head. "But I have no proof. Just a gut feeling. And that is not enough to arrest a man in this town." The next day, Abigail kept her promise to the sheriff. She opened her school. The only space available was a section of the livery stable that the owner, a gruff but decent man named Henderson, agreed to let her use in exchange for her teaching his son to read. She swept the dirt floor and set up wooden crates for desks. Her students were a motley collection of 7 children. There was Henderson's boy, 2 shy sisters whose father was a Mexican vaquero, a solemn boy from the Apache settlement, and 3 children of the Anglo ranchers. They sat in a small, nervous circle, eyeing each other with the ingrained suspicion of their parents. Abigail smiled, her manner easy and warm. She drew a letter A in the dirt with a stick. "This is the first letter of the alphabet," she said. "It is for Apple, and for Arrow, and for Abigail. It is also for Apache." The Apache boy, whose name was Little Hawk, looked up, surprised. One of the rancher's sons, a boy with a freckled face and a defiant cowlick, spoke up. "My PA says Apaches are savages." Abigail did not scold him. She simply asked, "Little Hawk, what did you eat for breakfast this morning?" The boy thought for a moment. "Corn cake," he said quietly. "And what about you, Billy?" she asked the rancher's son. "Bacon and biscuits," he said proudly. "Well then," Abigail said with a cheerful nod, "it seems everyone eats breakfast. Perhaps we have more in common than you think. Now, let us try the letter B. It is for biscuit, and for brother, and for brave." The tension in the small circle eased, replaced by a tentative curiosity. For a few hours, in the dusty, horse-scented air of the stable, the conflicts of the adults faded away, and there were only children, learning together. That peace was shattered after nightfall. A patrol of cavalry, acting on a fresh set of rumors likely started by Crow, rode into the Apache settlement just outside of town. They were looking for stolen goods from the robbery. They found nothing, but they needed to bring someone back to show they were doing their job. They chose Naichi's cousin, a young man named Taza, dragging him from his family's wickiup. Word reached Abigail through Little Hawk, who ran all the way to her boarding house, his face streaked with tears. Abigail grabbed her medical bag and hurried to the settlement. She found Taza held between 2 troopers, his body trembling, his face slick with sweat in the cool night air. The captain in charge was a young lieutenant, full of bluster and uncertainty. "This man is a suspect, ma'am," he said stiffly. "He will be taken to the fort for questioning." Abigail ignored him. She pushed her way forward and placed a hand on Taza's forehead. It was burning with fever. "This man is not a suspect," she said, her voice ringing with a certainty that made the young officer pause. "He is a patient. Look at his eyes. He is in the grip of a malarial fever. He has been like this for 3 days. A man this sick could not sit a horse, let alone rob a supply wagon. If you take him on a long ride to the fort tonight, you will be delivering a corpse." Her authority as a nurse, a woman of medicine and science, was unassailable. The lieutenant, faced with the prospect of a dead prisoner and a lot of paperwork, hesitated. He looked at Taza's shivering form, and then at Abigail's steady, determined face. He cursed under his breath. "Release him," he ordered his men. The cavalry rode off, their raid a failure. But the damage was done. The next morning, a crudely painted sign was nailed to the wall of the general store, in large, dripping letters. It read, "No Indians after dark." The town had drawn a line, turning a shared space into a battlefield of fear. The children at her school were quiet that day, the easy camaraderie of the day before replaced by a somber awareness of the world outside the stable walls. That evening, as Abigail was leaving the school, Naichi stepped out from the shadows of the blacksmith's shop. His face was a mask of grim resolve. He had seen the sign. He had seen the fear in his people's eyes. He knew that time was running out. "The sheriff will not protect us," he said, his voice a low, hard thing. "The soldiers will not believe us. The town wants our blood or our land. They will have one or the other soon." "We have to show them the truth," Abigail insisted. "We have to find my brother. He looked at her, his dark eyes seeming to see right through her, to the core of her strength and her fear. "You have a piece of that truth," he said. "The letter from your brother, the paper with his words. It is proof for the white man." "It is not enough," she said. "Pike and Crow will just say it is a forgery." "Then we must find more," he said. "Your brother disappeared in the canyons to the north, a place the railroad surveyors call the Box Canyon. It is a hard place, dangerous. You will not find it on your own." He held out his hand, not to touch her, but as a gesture of a stark and solemn pact. "Give me the letter," he said, "and I will take you to him." They left before the first hint of dawn, slipping out of Dust Haven while the town was still wrapped in a blanket of sleep and cool desert air. Abigail rode a steady mule borrowed from the livery, its plodding gait a comforting rhythm in the immense silence. Naiches moved ahead on foot, a gray, silent shape that seemed to be part of the landscape itself, his steps making almost no sound on the rocky ground. The journey to Box Canyon was a lesson in the brutal character of the land. It was a place that did not suffer fools or the unprepared. The sun climbed the sky and became a physical weight, pressing down on them, bleaching the color from the rocks and sucking the moisture from the air. "I assume there is a reason we are walking through what appears to be the devil's own bake oven instead of taking the main trail," Abigail commented after an hour of silence, her voice a little hoarse. Naiches paused and pointed to a distant plume of dust rising from the very trail she had mentioned. "Soldiers," he said. It was a complete explanation. He led them through a labyrinth of arroyos and canyons, a route that would have been invisible to anyone else. Abigail, a woman accustomed to the neat grid of city streets, felt a profound sense of being lost. Yet she also felt perfectly safe. The man leading her was as much a part of this world as the hawks circling high overhead. He seemed to read the land as she would read a book, noting the slightest disturbance in the soil, the way a branch was broken, the scrape of a shod hoof on a rock. He spoke only when necessary, to point out a loose rock, to identify a bird call, or to announce a brief rest in the sliver of shade offered by a cliff overhang. His silence was a stark contrast to her own nature. She found herself filling the quiet with observations, her voice a bit too loud in the stillness. She remarked on the strange beauty of a blooming cactus, the surprising cold of the water in their canteens, and the unsettling rattle of a snake they disturbed, which Naiches dispatched with a single, swift motion of a thrown rock. "You are very economical with your movements," she observed as he retrieved the rock. He glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "Waste is a luxury," he said, and continued walking. His reply was not a rebuke, but a simple statement of fact, a core principle of his existence. It made her feel, for a moment, like a frivolous creature, all wasted words and unnecessary thoughts. Late in the afternoon, a sudden wind rose from the west, carrying a wall of red dust that blotted out the sun. Naiches simply stopped, turned his back to the wind, and pulled a cloth over his face. He motioned for her to do the same and to get on the ground behind a cluster of large boulders. The world disappeared into a roaring, abrasive fog. Dust filled Abigail's mouth and nose, stinging her eyes. The wind shrieked, and she could feel the grit scouring the exposed skin of her hands and neck. It was terrifying, a raw and untamable force of nature. And then, as quickly as it had begun, it was over. The wind died down, and the dust began to settle, revealing a world that had been scrubbed clean and painted a fresh coat of red. Naiches was already on his feet, his gaze scanning the horizon. He seemed completely unaffected, as if the sandstorm had been no more than a brief shower. It was in these moments that the gulf between their worlds felt widest. She was a visitor here, a guest in a harsh and unforgiving house. He was the house itself. They reached the entrance to Box Canyon as the sun began to touch the western mountains. It was a narrow slit in a towering wall of red rock, a place of deep shadows and profound silence. As they entered, the temperature dropped. The air grew still and heavy, The canyon walls rose hundreds of feet on either side, so close together that she could stretch out her arms and almost touch both sides. They found the campsite a half-mile in. It was Nietzsche's who saw it first. Of course. He stopped and pointed to an area near the canyon wall. To Abigail, it looked like nothing more than a patch of empty ground. But he showed her the signs. A bed of pine needles that had been flattened by a sleeping roll. The faint black ring of a small, smokeless fire, its ashes carefully scattered, and the faint, parallel indentations in the sandy soil. A wagon came here, Nietzsche said, his voice a low murmur that seemed loud in the enclosed space. He followed the tracks. It came, and then it left. He pointed to a second set of fainter tracks overlying the first. And then it came back, and left again. Someone returned to hide their trail. A cold dread settled in Abigail's stomach. Eli had been here, and someone had come back to erase the fact of his presence. They searched the small campsite with a meticulous care. Abigail, with her eye for small details, found the first clue. Tucked into a crevice in the rock wall, as if it had been blown there by the wind, was a small, brass button. It was tarnished, but she recognized the eagle insignia immediately. It was from a United States cavalry uniform. Then Nietzsche's, sifting through the dirt near where the fire had been, found the second piece. It was a tiny, torn scrap of oilskin paper, no bigger than her thumb. It had been partially burned, but on it were the unmistakable lines of a map, and a few handwritten words. Pressure drop at Junction B, divert flow to holding. It was technical jargon, but she understood the implications. It was a piece of a hydraulic map, a map for a pipeline. Eli had found it. He had discovered their secret plan to divert the water, and he had the proof. He had been here, in this canyon, with evidence that could ruin Pike and his associates, and they had come back for him. The two-way tracks were no longer a mystery. They were a threat. Their return to Dust Haven was a silent, grim march. The witty remarks and observations were gone, replaced by a shared, unspoken urgency. The clues they carried felt both immensely important and terrifyingly small. A button and a scrap of paper against the power of men like Pike and the hatred of men like Crow. As they neared the town, they could hear the noise, a low hum of angry voices that grew louder with every step. A crowd was gathered in the street in front of the saloon. A town meeting had been called, and from the looks of it, the entire population had turned out. They saw Judd Crow standing on the saloon porch, his voice carrying over the crowd. "We have been patient," he bellowed, his fist striking the porch railing for emphasis. "We have waited for the law to act, and what has happened? Nothing. The Apache run free. While honest folk live in fear, they steal our payroll, they threaten our children, and they squat on land that is vital to the future of this town. We need that water, and they are standing in the way of progress." A roar of approval went up from the crowd. Then Barnaby Pike stepped forward, his expression one of sober civic concern. "Mr. Crow speaks with passion," Pike said, his voice smoother and more reasonable, but no less dangerous. "But let us speak of facts. Our new railroad, the lifeblood of this community, requires a secure and reliable source of water. I have drafted a resolution of water security to be presented to the territorial government. It will declare the area around the so-called Sacred Spring a utility easement for the good of the entire territory. It is a matter of public safety and economic necessity." It was a brilliant move, wrapping his theft in the respectable language of law and public works. He was not stealing their water. He was securing it for the good of all. Abigail felt a surge of cold anger. This was it. This was the moment it all came to a head. She pushed her way through the edge of the crowd, Nietzsche's a silent, imposing shadow behind her. "Mr. Pike," she called out, her voice clear and steady. The crowd turned, surprised by the interruption. "You speak of facts. Let me offer one of my own." She held up the scorched letter. "This is a letter from my brother. Eli Whitlock, found at the site of the robbery. In it, he states clearly, the robbers were not Apache. A murmur went through the crowd. Pike's face hardened. Before he could respond, Judd Crow laughed. A harsh, contemptuous sound. A letter, he sneered, stepping forward. A convenient letter from a man who has mysteriously disappeared. A man who was likely in on the robbery himself and fled with the money. How do we know you did not write that yourself? Missy, to protect your savage friend there. He pointed a thick finger at Nightcheese. The crowd's suspicion shifted instantly, their faces turning hostile. Sheriff Doyle pushed his way onto the porch. That is enough. Crow! His face was grim. He looked at Abigail, at the letter in her hand, and then at the angry faces staring back at him. Miss Whitlock, I cannot accept this letter as proof of anything. As Mr. Crow points out, its origin is questionable. It is my brother's handwriting, she insisted. That may be, the sheriff said, his voice heavy with resignation. But it is not enough. Not against all this. He gestured to the crowd. I'm giving you 3 days. 3 days to bring me something solid, something more than a burned letter and a wild story. If you cannot, then for the safety of this town, I will have no choice but to form a posse and personally escort Nightcheese and his people out of this valley permanently. The ultimatum hung in the air, a death sentence for the Chiricahuas claim to their home. The crowd dispersed, muttering with a grim satisfaction. They had what they wanted, a deadline. Later, as twilight settled over the land, Abigail and Nightcheese stood by the livery stable. The weight of the sheriff's words was a physical presence between them. Nightcheese looked toward the hills where his people were camped. His face, illuminated by the fading light, was like carved stone. There will be no war, he said, his voice quiet but absolute. I will not lead our young men to their deaths against rifles and soldiers. The old ones and the children depend on the water. I will protect them. I will protect the spring. But I will not do it with blood. Abigail looked at him. At this man who had every reason to hate, to fight, to unleash the warrior she knew was inside him. But his strength was in his restraint. He was choosing a harder path, a path of preservation over vengeance. In that moment, her respect for him, which had been growing steadily since she first saw him with the injured boy, deepened into something warmer, something more personal. It was a profound sense of admiration, a quiet flicker of fellowship in a world that seemed determined to tear them apart. They were two people from different worlds, armed with a button, a scrap of a map, and a burned letter, standing against a tide of greed and fear. And they were, for now, completely on their own. The 2 days that followed the sheriff's ultimatum were a special kind of torment. Time was a finite resource, draining away like water into sand, and they were no closer to finding the proof they needed. Dust Haven had become a prison of watchful eyes. Every time Abigail stepped out of the boarding house, she felt the stares. Some were curious, some were sympathetic, but most were hostile, fueled by the poison Judd Crow continued to pour in the saloon. Nightcheese had disappeared from the town itself, but she knew he was close. She would catch glimpses of him on the ridges overlooking the valley, a solitary figure watching, waiting. They were trapped, stalked by a deadline and a bounty hunter who was growing more brazen by the hour. They knew Crow was actively hunting them. He had gathered a handful of the most belligerent ranchers and railroad men into a makeshift posse, riding the trails under the pretense of searching for outlaws. But their real purpose was clear. They were looking for Nightcheese. They were looking for an excuse. On the morning of the final day, Nightcheese appeared at the livery stable just as the sun was beginning to bake the air. His face was set in grim lines. They are moving cattle today, he said, his voice a low vibration. From the high pasture down to the railhead. The trails will be busy. Crow will use it as cover. We must move now. Move where? Abigail asked, her heart sinking. We have looked everywhere. "There is one more place," he said. "A surveyor's marker near the canyon. Your brother may have left something there. A sign. It is a risk. We will be in the open." It was a sliver of a chance, but it was the only one they had. They took the mule and a horse from the stable, Henderson, the owner, giving them a silent, worried nod, and rode west, away from the dust of the cattle drive, into a broken land of rock and cactus. Naiches led them on a weaving, difficult path, staying low in the arroyos, using every fold in the land for cover. The tension was a living thing, a third rider that traveled with them. Every gust of wind sounded like the hoofbeats of approaching horses. Every shadow seemed to hold a rifleman. They were making their way through a particularly dense thicket of shoya cactus, the plants like skeletal, grasping arms covered in a deceptively soft-looking fuzz of spines. The path was narrow, forcing them to ride single file. Abigail, her mind consumed with 1,000 worries, let her mule drift too close to the edge of the path. The long, heavy fabric of her riding skirt, a symbol of her propriety and a constant nuisance in this wilderness. Snagged on a cholla branch. The contact was slight, but it was enough. The joint of the cactus broke away, as chollas are designed to do, and embedded itself in her skirt and the flesh of her leg beneath it. A cluster of 100 barbed needles sank into her calf at once. She cried out, a sharp gasp of shock and agony. The pain was instantaneous and ferocious, a burning, tearing sensation. Her mule, startled by her cry and the sudden pull on its flank, shied violently. Abigail was thrown from the saddle, landing hard on the rocky ground. Her leg was a bonfire of pain, and she could see the wicked segmented branch of the cactus clinging to her. Its spines sunk deep. Before Naiches could even dismount, a new sound filled the air, a low rumble that grew rapidly into a thunderous roar. From over the next rise, a wave of brown and white appeared. A small herd of wild mustangs, spooked by the cattle drive or perhaps by Crow's riders, was stampeding directly toward them. The ground began to tremble. There was no time to think. Naiches leaped from his horse, his knife already in his hand. The horses were a storm of dust and hooves, only seconds away. Abigail tried to scramble back, to pull her leg free, but the cholla held her fast, each movement sending fresh waves of agony up her leg as the barbs dug deeper. Naiches did not try to pull the cactus free. He knew it was useless. Instead, he grabbed the thick wool of her skirt above the embedded branch. With a single, powerful rip, he tore a long, wide strip of fabric away. From her calf to the hem, the sound of the tearing cloth was lost in the thunder of the approaching herd. Freed from the snag, he grabbed her under the arms and half dragged, half carried her behind a tall outcrop of rock just as the lead horses galloped past, their eyes wide with panic. The stampede split around their rocky sanctuary, a torrent of animal fear and power. They were so close she could feel the heat from the horses' bodies and the sting of the gravel thrown up by their hooves. In a minute, they were gone. The thunder receded, leaving behind a ringing silence and a cloud of settling dust. Abigail leaned against the rock, breathing in ragged gasps, her leg throbbing with a pain so intense it made her feel nauseous. Naiches knelt beside her, the torn strip of her dress still in his hand. "Do not move," he commanded softly. With the tip of his knife, he carefully pried the cholla branch from her leg. She bit her lip to keep from screaming as the spines, each one barbed like a fishhook, were pulled from her flesh, leaving behind a grid of bleeding puncture wounds. He worked with a surgeon's focused intensity, his face impassive. When the branch was free, he took the strip of her torn dress and, without a word, began to bind the wound, creating a tight, clean bandage. It was in that precise moment, with Naiches kneeling over her, his hands gentle on her injured leg, a bloody strip of her own dress in his hand, that Judd Crow and his 5 riders appeared on the ridge above them. They reined in their horses, their rifles already in their hands. To them, the scene below was not one of rescue, but of brutal assault. they saw a savage kneeling over a white woman, her dress torn, blood on his hands. It was everything they had been waiting for, the perfect, damning picture. Well, well, Crow's voice dripped with triumphant malice. Looks like we found him. Boys, caught in the act. He leveled his rifle, its dark muzzle a perfect circle aimed at Nietzsche's chest. His men followed his lead, the sound of 5 hammers being cocked clicking loudly in the sudden stillness. Abigail looked up, her vision blurred by pain and tears. She saw the rifles, the hard, hate-filled faces, the absolute certainty in their eyes. She saw Nietzsche's, poised to rise, his hand moving toward the knife at his belt. It was a scene of perfect, inevitable violence. A circle of hatred, generations old, was about to close in blood and death right here, in this dusty, sun-baked patch of ground. And something inside her broke. It was not just the pain or the fear, but a profound and soul-deep exhaustion. She was tired of the suspicion, the lies, the constant threat that hung over this land like a shroud. She looked from Crow's smug face to Nietzsche's grim resolve, at the guns that promised a bloody, pointless end. "End it!" The cry was torn from her, a raw, desperate sob. Just end it. Her words were a plea to the universe, a cry to stop the whole terrible cycle of violence. But Judd Crow heard only what he wanted to hear. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. He turned his head slightly, speaking to the men beside him without taking his eyes off Nietzsche's. "You hear that? Boys," he said, his voice carrying in the quiet air. "The lady wants an end to this. She wants to see this Apache finished. Let us give the lady what she wants." A low growl of agreement came from the posse. Their fingers tightened on their triggers. The world seemed to shrink to the space between the rifle barrels and Nietzsche's heart. But Nietzsche's did not rise to fight. He did not draw his knife. Instead, he slowly, deliberately, lowered his hands. He held up the strip of cloth he had just used to bandage her leg. It was her dress, her fabric, and it was stained with her blood. He held it up for them all to see, a flag of truce in a war that only one side was fighting. "I save people," he said, his voice not loud, but clear and resonant, cutting through the hatred. "I do not harm them." The words and the sight of the makeshift bandage were a splash of cold water on a hot fire. It did not extinguish the flames, but it made them sputter. The absolute certainty on the faces of Crow's men wavered. They looked from the bloody cloth to Abigail's torn dress and the obvious, painful wound on her leg. They looked at Nietzsche's, who was not snarling like a cornered animal, but standing with a strange, quiet dignity. The story Crow had told them, the one they had so eagerly believed, suddenly had a hole in it. A few of the rifles lowered an inch. Sheriff Doyle, who had been following the posse at a distance, arrived at that moment, cresting the ridge and taking in the scene. He saw the standoff, but he also saw the evidence that Crow's men were just beginning to see. He saw a rescue, not an attack. Abigail pushed herself up, her face pale, but her eyes blazing. The pain was a white-hot fire, but her mind was suddenly, icily clear. She leaned against the rock for support, her gaze locking with Crow's. The wit that had so often been her shield and her comfort returned to her, dry as dust. "My dress," she announced, her voice trembling only slightly, "has been sacrificed for the cause of justice. Whoever is responsible for mending it, I expect you to sign a receipt." The sheer, unexpected absurdity of the statement shattered the last of the tension. It was so out of place, so practical in a moment of high drama, that one of the ranchers let out a choked laugh. Judd Crow stared at her, his face turning a shade of purple. He had orchestrated the perfect scene of frontier justice, and this schoolteacher had ruined it with a remark about sewing. The moment was broken. Sheriff Doyle trotted his horse down the slope, placing himself between the posse and their target. "Stand down, Crow," he ordered, his voice carrying the weary weight of the law. "It appears you have made a mistake." Crow spat on the ground, his eyes burning with frustration and fury. But he had lost his audience. His men were already lowering their rifles, their faces a mixture of confusion and embarrassment. They had been ready to kill, and now they felt like fools. In the confusion, Nietzsche's took Abigail's arm. "We are leaving," he said softly. He helped her onto her horse, his touch gentle and sure. They turned and melted back into the labyrinth of canyons, leaving the sheriff to deal with the fuming, defeated bounty hunter. They rode for another mile before stopping in a hidden alcove where water seeped from the rock. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and the sharp, green scent of bruised cactus that still clung to her clothes. Nietzsche's helped her dismount and then carefully unwrapped the bandage to examine the wound. The bleeding had mostly stopped. As he cleaned it with fresh water, she watched him, her fear and pain giving way to a new and unshakable feeling. She had seen him in the face of death, and he had chosen not to kill, but to heal. He had used a piece of her own life, her dress, to save her, in the quiet of the canyon, with the sun burning down on the rocks outside. Abigail Whitlock knew, with a certainty that went deeper than any fact in a book, that she had placed her trust in the right man. The torn piece of her dress, now a clean bandage around her leg, was a constant reminder of how close they had come to a violent end. In the cool quiet of the hidden alcove, Nietzsche's finished tending to her wounds with a focused gentleness that seemed at odds with the harshness of his world. The immediate danger had passed, but the sheriff's deadline loomed over them, a ticking clock with only a day left on it. They could not go back to Dust Haven empty-handed. "The map piece you found," Nietzsche said, breaking the silence. His voice was low, thoughtful. "The notes on it, they were about moving water." Abigail nodded, her mind replaying the image of the scrap of paper. It said something about a pressure drop and diverting flow. "They are not just planning a pipeline," Nietzsche said, his eyes distant, looking at something she could not see. "They have already begun. They are liars, but they are not lazy men. To move that much water, they would need a place to hold it. A reservoir, somewhere hidden." He rose to his feet and scanned the surrounding terrain, not as a man looking at scenery, but as one reading a complex page of writing. He pointed to a line of low hills to the north, the surveyors for the railroad. They avoided those hills. They said the rock was too unstable for blasting. That is a lie. The rock there is ancient and strong. They avoided it because they did not want anyone to look too closely at what was there. Hope, a stubborn and resilient weed, pushed its way through Abigail's fear. It was a long shot, but it was a direction. It was a purpose. They rested only until the fierce heat of midday had passed, then set out again, moving with a renewed sense of urgency. The journey took them into a part of the landscape that was even more desolate and forgotten. It was a place of twisted rock and thorny vegetation. Nietzsche's followed a trail that was no trail at all, a path of intuition and deep knowledge. He pointed out the subtle signs of recent activity, a heavy wagon track in a place no wagon should be, a survey stake driven into the ground far from the railroad line, the unnatural cleanness of a path cleared through a patch of dense mesquite. They found the reservoir late in the afternoon. It was cleverly hidden in a natural basin between two hills, a man-made wound on the earth disguised with brush and transplanted yucca, a long, partially buried trough covered with canvas and dirt, snaked its way down from the direction of the sacred spring. It was the artery of the theft. Beside the large, tarp-covered pool of stagnant water stood a small, crudely built wooden shack. They approached with caution, but the site was deserted. The air was still and heavy with the smell of tar and dry rot. Inside the shack, the story of the conspiracy lay scattered on a rough table. There were more maps, detailed schematics of pumps and pipelines, and there was a ledger book. Abigail's hands trembled as she opened it. The pages were filled with columns of figures, records of wages and supply costs, and then she saw it. A separate page, tucked into the back, under the heading Security Expenses. There were a series of large cash payments listed. Next to each payment was a date, and next to each date was a signature of receipt. The signature was a messy, arrogant scrawl, but the two initials were clear J.C. Below one of the signatures was a dark, greasy smudge that was unmistakably the print of a thumb. It was the proof they needed. A direct link between the railroad's money and Judd Crow. Nightcheese, who had been standing guard at the door, went rigid. He held up a hand for silence, his head cocked, listening. Abigail's blood ran cold, but the sound was not of approaching riders. It was the buzzing of flies, a thick, insistent cloud of them, gathered near a mound of freshly turned earth a few dozen yards from the shack. A terrible premonition washed over Abigail. She thought of her brother, of his disappearance. She walked toward the mound on unsteady legs, her injured calf throbbing in protest. The smell of death was thick in the air. The grave was shallow, a hasty, disrespectful hole. A worn leather boot stuck out from the loose dirt. She fell to her knees, her mind screaming Eli's name, but Nightcheese put a firm hand on her shoulder, stopping her from digging any further. He knelt beside the grave and, with his knife, carefully scraped away some of the dirt from the dead man's exposed pant leg. The fabric was a coarse denim, common among the railroad workers. He uncovered a hand. The fingers curled. The man was a stranger. His features were lost to the ravages of the desert and the quick, brutal manner of his death. But it was not her brother. The relief was so overwhelming it almost buckled her, immediately followed by a wave of sorrow for the unknown man who had been discarded here like so much trash. He was a loose end, a witness who had been silenced. Nightcheese looked at the shallow grave, his face carved from stone. He did not speak of vengeance or of the men who had done this. Instead, he found a flat, smooth stone from the nearby wash. He placed it at the head of the grave. Then he stood, his back straight, and spoke a few quiet words in his own language, his voice a low, resonant murmur that was not a prayer for the dead, but a promise to the earth that had received him. It was an act of profound and simple decency in a place of utter depravity. It settled Abigail's trembling heart. She saw in that small, quiet ritual a strength far greater than any rifle or legal document. It was the strength of a people who knew that even in death, a man deserved respect. Back in Dust Haven, the wall of paper was exactly as formidable as Nightcheese had predicted. Sheriff Doyle, his face a mask of grim determination after seeing the ledger page Abigail had carefully copied, confronted Barnaby Pike in the saloon. The foreman did not even have the decency to look nervous. He smiled his oily smile and produced a sheaf of documents from his coat pocket. "I'm afraid you are mistaken." "Sheriff," Pike said smoothly, spreading the papers on a table. "These are federally approved land use permits and territorial water rights assignments, all perfectly legal. The railroad has been granted full authority to develop the necessary resources to complete its contract. It is a matter of national importance." The papers were dense with legal language, stamped with official-looking seals. The sheriff, a man of simple laws and direct justice, was lost in the thicket of clauses and subclactions. He was beaten, not by a lie, but by a more powerful, more complicated truth. The law, in the hands of a rich man, was a weapon. Abigail left the sheriff's office feeling the last of her hope drain away. They had the truth, but the truth was not enough. As she stood in the dusty street, watching the sun set on their final day, a quiet voice spoke her name. It was the town minister, a thin, stooped man named Reverend Michael. He had been a quiet presence in the town, a man of books and gentle sermons who rarely involved himself in public affairs. "Miss Whitlock," he said, his eyes kind behind his spectacles. "Your brother spoke to me a few weeks ago. He was a good man, but a troubled one. He said he had discovered something that put him in great danger." The minister held out a thick, sealed envelope. "He asked me to keep this for him. He said if anything happened to him, I was to give it to you, and only you." Abigail took the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was a complete, unburned copy of the letter she carried, along with several pages of Eli's notes. He had documented everything: the illegal pipeline, the secret reservoir, the payments to Crow. He had even drawn a rough map. It was a complete account of the entire conspiracy. Her brother was not just a victim. He had been an investigator, a man trying to expose the truth on his own. Meanwhile, Naiches had returned to his people. He found the elders gathered in council, their face etched with worry and thirst. The flow of water from the spring had slowed to a trickle, the effect of the secret diversion. The children were listless, and the mood was dangerously volatile. One of the younger warriors, his face a mask of anger, spoke for many. "We have waited long enough," he argued. "Our children are thirsty. The white men steal our water and blame us for their crimes. We should fight. We should die as warriors, not watch our families wither away from thirst." A murmur of agreement went through the gathered men. But Naiches stepped into the center of the circle. He was not a chief, but he commanded their respect. "If we fight, we die," he said, his voice quiet but carrying in the still air. "And our story dies with us. They will say we were savages, just as they have always said. They will write in their books that they were right to kill us. But if we wait, if we hold to the truth, our story will live. It will be stronger than their rifles. It will be a story of a people who defended their home, not with arrows, but with honor. Let them be the ones to break the law. Let them be the ones to spill the first blood. We will hold to our truth. We lose everything if we lose our story." His words, spoken with the calm certainty of a man who had looked into the heart of his enemy and seen its weakness, settled the anger. He offered them not a glorious death, but a difficult, patient life. He offered them the strength of their own integrity. The council fell silent, and then the oldest of the chiefs gave a slow, solemn nod. They would wait. The next morning, the last morning, Abigail held her class as usual. She could not bear to sit and wait for the end. She gathered the children on the porch of the church, under the wide, open sky. The tension in the town was a palpable thing, but here, for a little while, there was a small circle of peace. They sat together, the sons and daughters of ranchers, vaqueros, and Apache warriors, and they practiced their letters in the dirt. "Water," Abigail said, drawing the word. The children copied her, their small fingers tracing the shapes. "Truth," she said next. "Home." The words hung in the air, simple and profound, a prayer spoken by the innocent. That evening, as the last light faded from the sky, Abigail sat alone on the steps of the boarding house, mending the long tear in her dress. Her stitches were small and neat, a practical task to occupy her hands and quiet her mind. The fabric was a good, sturdy wool, but she knew the mend would always be visible, a scar on the cloth. She heard a soft footstep and looked up to see Naiches standing before her. He watched her for a moment, his face in shadow. He said nothing, but he held out his hand. In his palm lay a small, rectangular piece of soft, tanned deer hide. It was a patch. "My stitches are not as straight as yours," he said, the corner of his mouth twitching in what might have been a smile. "But the leather is strong. It will hold." She took it from him, her fingers brushing his. His hand was warm and calloused, the hand of a man who knew the world through touch. She looked from the rough piece of leather to the nearly finished seam on her dress. A genuine, unforced smile touched her lips. She imagined him trying to sew, his large, capable hands fumbling with a needle and thread. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft. "I think the stitches of a warrior might be just what this dress needs." For a moment, they shared a look of perfect understanding, a small, quiet island of humor and warmth in a sea of trouble. It was not a solution to their problems. The sheriff's deadline had arrived. Crow and Pike were still in control, but in the simple, awkward gift of a leather patch, a bond that had been forged in crisis was sealed with a quiet, human grace. The sun set on the final day. bleeding orange and purple across the horizon. A deceptive peace settled over Dust Haven, the kind of quiet that precedes a breaking storm. In the fading light, the news sign on the general store, "No Indians after dark," was a stark, ugly wound on the face of the town. The sheriff's deadline had arrived. The air itself felt thin, stretched to the point of tearing. The breaking point came not with a gunshot, but with a woman's scream. It was Maria, the mother of the young mestizo boy Naiches had rescued. She ran into the main street, her face a mask of terror. Her son, Miguel, was gone. He had been playing behind their small adobe house and had simply vanished. Judd Crow was out of the saloon before her screams faded. He was not drunk, but his eyes held the feverish gleam of a man who had been nursing a potent brew of hatred and frustration. This was the opportunity he had been waiting for. "An abduction," he roared, his voice booming through the twilight. He pointed a thick, accusing finger toward the dark hills where the Apache made their camp. "The savages have taken a child. I warned you, they have grown bold. And now they are stealing our children from our very yards." It was a lie, crafted from air and malice. But it was the spark the town's powder keg needed. The saloon doors swung open, spilling angry, frightened men into the street. Torches were lit, their flickering flames casting long, dancing shadows that twisted men's faces into monstrous shapes. The post station bell began to ring, not with the measured tones of arriving mail, but with a frantic, clanging alarm that echoed the rising panic. A mob was being born, its heart beating with a rhythm of fear and its mind poisoned by Crow's words. As the crowd surged toward the sheriff's office, demanding action, demanding blood, Abigail ran for the church. She found Reverend Michael lighting the lamps, his hands trembling slightly. "It is a lie," she said, her voice breathless. She held out the envelope Eli had left with him. "This is the truth. You must help me." The minister read his own copy of Eli's notes, his face growing paler with every line. He looked from the pages to the torchlit mob gathering outside. "The truth is a quiet voice, my dear," he said, his own voice barely a whisper. "I fear it cannot be heard over such a roar." Just then, the wind began to rise, a low moan at first. It quickly grew into a scouring gale, picking up the loose red dust of the street and turning the air into a thick, gritty fog. A sandstorm was coming, a physical manifestation of the town's churning chaos. Naiches saw the torches from the ridge. He heard the bell. He knew what it meant. They had fabricated a reason. The time for waiting was over. He began to move, not toward the town, but parallel to it, a ghost slipping through the thickening curtain of dust. Abigail, with the minister in tow, pushed her way through the angry crowd to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Doyle stood on the steps, a shotgun held loosely in his hands, his face a stony mask of a man trying to hold back a flood with his bare hands. "They took the boy." Sheriff Rancher yelled, "We need a posse." "We need a rope," Crow bellowed from the front of the mob. "You will get nothing until I have facts," Doyle shouted back, his voice nearly lost in the wind. "I have facts." Abigail's voice cut through the noise. She stood beside the sheriff, holding up Eli's letter. "The fact is that Judd Crow and Barnaby Pike staged the robbery to steal water rights and start a war. The proof is at a hidden reservoir in the northern hills. She is lying to protect her savage lover," Crow screamed. But a few faces in the crowd turned toward her, their expressions uncertain. The teacher had always been a straight talker. "Then let us find out," Sheriff Doyle said, his gaze locking with Abigail's. He saw the unwavering truth in her eyes. It was his turn to take a risk. "You say there is proof. Show me. I will take 5 men. We will ride there now. The rest of you will stay here and you will keep the peace. Or so help me. I will arrest every last one of you for inciting a riot." It was a gamble, but it worked. The authority in his voice, and the promise of a swift resolution, held the mob in check. Crow, seeing his control slip, could only fume as the sheriff deputized 4 of the town's more level-headed men. They rode out into the gathering storm, Abigail leading the way. The wind was a physical force now, tearing at them, the sand stinging their eyes and choking their lungs. They found the reservoir just as Abigail had described. In the swirling light of their lanterns, the truth was laid bare. The maps, the blasting powder, and the ledger, with Crow's signature and the greasy print of his thumb next to the payments. One of the deputies, a man who had been ready to ride on the Apache camp an hour before, cursed softly. "We have been played for fools." They had just turned to ride back when a single gunshot echoed through the storm. It came from the direction of the town. They spurred their horses, riding hard into the teeth of the gale. The shot had been Judd Crow's last, desperate act. Realizing the sheriff would return with the truth, he had fired his pistol into the air to create panic and chaos. In the ensuing confusion, as the remainder of the mob surged forward, he had made his move. He grabbed Abigail as she and the sheriff rode back into the street. He hauled her from her mule, holding her in front of him as a human shield, the cold metal of a pistol barrel pressed against her temple. "Nobody moves," he screamed, his voice raw with fury and desperation. His eyes were wild, darting back and forth. "The deal is off. Sheriff, I will not hang for this." The street was a nightmare of roaring wind, swirling red dust, and terrified shouts. The lanterns cast a hazy, hellish glow, making it impossible to see more than a few feet in any direction. Through this maelstrom, Nietzsche's came. He had used the storm as his cover, moving through the chaos like a wraith. He emerged from a thick cloud of dust behind Crow, a coil of rope in one hand, his knife in the other. He was the land's own quiet fury, come to reclaim its balance. Crow saw him at the last second and shoved Abigail away. Turning to face this new threat, he fired his pistol, but the shot went wide, the bullet whining away into the roaring darkness. The two men circled each other in the chaotic, flickering light, a deadly dance in the heart of the storm. It was not a clean fight. It was brutal and primal. Crow was bigger and stronger, swinging the heavy rope like a club. Nietzsche's was faster, more agile, using the shifting, blinding dust to his advantage. He ducked under a wild swing of the rope, scooping up a handful of sand and flinging it directly into Crow's face. The bounty hunter roared in pain and surprise, clawing at his eyes. In that moment of blindness, Nietzsche's lunged. He did not use the knife to kill, but to cut the gun belt from Crow's waist. The heavy pistols fell to the ground. Now they were equals, armed only with their hands and their will. They crashed together, a tangle of limbs and fury. They rolled in the dirt, trading blows, their grunts of effort lost in the shriek of the wind. Nietzsche's gained the upper hand. He was on top of Crow, his knife pressed against the thick column of the bounty hunter's throat. His face was a mask of cold rage, the face of a warrior whose people had been pushed too far. He had the power to end it, to exact a final, bloody justice for all the lies and all the suffering. Abigail, scrambling to her feet, saw him. She saw the killing intent in his eyes. This was the moment that would define him, that would define them all. He could become the savage they had accused him of being, or he could be something more. "End it, Nietzsche's," she screamed, her voice cutting through the howl of the wind. He paused, the muscles in his arm rigid. His eyes met hers through the swirling dust. He saw not fear, but a desperate plea. It was the same plea she had cried in the desert, but the meaning was entirely new. It was not a cry to end the violence with more violence. It was a command to end the cycle of hatred with justice, not with vengeance. It was a plea for him to be the man she knew he was. His gaze held hers for a long second, and in that second, the killing rage in his eyes subsided, replaced by the quiet, steady calm she had come to know. He had heard her. He had understood. That slight hesitation was all Sheriff Doyle needed. A single shot rang out, flatter and sharper than Crow's had been. It was not a killing shot. The sheriff's aim was true, and the bullet tore through the fleshy part of Crow's shoulder. The bounty hunter screamed, the fight going out of him as the shock and pain took over. He was captured. He was alive. In the sudden lull, as the deputies swarmed over the wounded Crow, the townspeople saw the truth. They saw the calm, weary face of the sheriff. They saw the courage of the teacher. And they saw the Apache warrior, who held a man's life in his hands and had chosen not to take it. The evidence was irrefutable, illuminated by the lanterns in the dying storm. Amid the chaos, no one had noticed Barnaby Pike. He was not a man of violence or confrontation. He was a creature of opportunity and escape. Seeing his plan crumble, seeing Crow captured, he had slipped away from the edge of the crowd. He ran, not toward the railroad camp, but into the open desert, hoping to lose himself in the sandstorm. He stumbled through the roaring darkness, his well-fed body no match for the fury of the land he had tried to tame. The wind scoured him, the sand blinded him, and the desert, vast and indifferent, swallowed him whole. By morning, when the storm had passed, they would find him pinned beneath a section of his own collapsed water trough, gasping for the very water he had tried to steal, a prisoner of his own greed. The morning after the storm was unnervingly quiet. The wind had scoured the air clean, and the sun rose into a sky of pale, washed-out blue. Dust Haven looked like it had been scrubbed raw. The red dust settled into every crack and crevice, a fine powder coating a town still in a state of shock. The silence was not peaceful. It was the quiet of exhaustion and shame. Judd Crow, his shoulder bandaged and his face a pasty gray, did not possess the fortitude for martyrdom. Faced with the stark reality of a sturdy jail cell and the sheriff's cold promise of a territorial judge with a fondness for the gallows, his bravado crumbled into a torrent of self-serving confession. He talked for 2 hours, his voice a whining drone, as Sheriff Doyle and a deputy took down every word. He laid the entire conspiracy bare, a sordid tale of greed spun in the back rooms of the saloon. He told them how Pike had hired him, not to hunt outlaws, but to create them. He described how they had used railroad dynamite and a stolen wagon to fake the supply robbery, how he had personally planted the cavalry button and left the shod horseshoe print. He admitted to starting the rumors, to fanning the flames of fear, and to planning the abduction of the mestizo boy as a final, desperate trigger for a massacre that would clear the Apache from the land for good. He gave them names of bribed officials, dates of payments, and the location of the hidden payroll money, all in exchange for a letter to the judge, pleading for leniency. He sold out every piece of his rotten soul to save his own skin. While Crow's world was shrinking to the size of a jail cell, Abigail's was expanding with a fragile, terrifying hope. She rode with the sheriff and the reverend back to the hidden reservoir. The shallow grave was undisturbed. This time, there was no rush, no threat of discovery. With a heavy heart and a quiet prayer from the minister, 2 deputies carefully exhumed the body. The man was a laborer, his hands calloused, his face weathered by the sun. He was roughly the same height as Eli, but his hair was darker, his frame thicker. He wore a cheap tin locket around his neck. Empty. He was a stranger. He was not Eli. The relief that washed over Abigail was so profound it left her weak. She sat on a rock, the world swimming before her eyes, and wept. She cried for the brother who might still be alive, and she cried for the unknown man who had died in his place, a man who likely had a family somewhere, a family who would never know his fate. Hope was a painful, double-edged thing. It was a lifeline, but it was also a fresh torment, the beginning of a new kind of waiting. That afternoon, Sheriff Doyle performed the hardest act of his career. He stood on the steps of his office, the same steps where he had issued his ultimatum, and faced the town. But this time, he was not alone. At his invitation, Naiches and 3 of the Chiricahua elders stood with him, their faces impassive, their dignity a silent rebuke to the town's recent madness. "I have something to say," the sheriff began, his voice clear and strong, carrying across the silent street. "I have failed this town. I have failed the law I swore to uphold, and I have failed these men." He turned and looked directly at Naiches. "On behalf of Dust Haven, I offer my deepest and most sincere apology to the Chiricahua people. We allowed fear and lies to blind us. We were wrong. He held up a piece of paper, a legal document he had drafted with the help of the Reverend, citing territorial precedent and native land rights. By the authority of my office, I hereby declare the area known as the Spring of the Ancestors a protected zone. Its water is to be held in trust by the Chiricahua people. Any attempt to divert or foul this water will be met with the full force of the law. He took the notice and nailed it to the post outside his office, the sound of his hammer blows echoing like a promise. Later that week, the ugly, hand-painted sign on the general store came down. In its place, Henderson, the livery owner, nailed up a new one. The lettering was neat and careful. It read simply, "Water for all." It was a start, a small, decent act in the wake of a great wrong. Abigail, watching from across the street, felt that the town, like her torn dress, was beginning the slow, painful work of mending itself. She decided to contribute a few stitches of her own. The post station bell had been a symbol of alarm and fear. She would give it a new voice. She cleared a small, shaded area beside the post station, building a long, rough-hewn bench and a small lectern. She called it the Bell House. It was a place for reading, for her open-air school, and for leaving messages for travelers. And on the bench, she placed a large wooden bucket, which she filled with fresh, cool water every morning. A ladle hung from a hook beside it. This was the first and most important rule of the Bell House. Anyone who was thirsty, traveler or townsperson, Anglo or Apache, was welcome to drink. A few days later, Nietzsche's came for her. He did not say where they were going, only that there was something she needed to see. They walked out of town and into the hills, following the path that led to the sacred spring. The water was already running stronger, the secret diversion pipe having been broken up and removed by a crew of shamefaced railroad workers under the sheriff's supervision. He led her to the heart of the spring, to a quiet, shaded place where the water bubbled up from the earth. In the center of the pool was a perfect circle of large, smooth river stones. "This is the circle of the ancestors," Nietzsche said, his voice softer here, imbued with a deep reverence. "Each stone is the memory of a leader of our people. For generations, each new leader has come here and placed his hand on the stone of his father and sworn to protect this water, to protect our people." He walked to the edge of the circle and picked up a new stone, one that had been set aside. It was flat and gray, about the size of a loaf of bread. He handed it to her. Then he took out his knife. "Our story is now part of this place," he said. "Your story. We must add it to the circle." Together, they knelt by the water, with the tip of his knife. With slow, painstaking care, he carved a few words into the face of the stone. It took a long time. When he was finished, he showed it to her. The lettering was rough but clear. It read, "End it with truth." He placed the new stone into the one empty space in the circle. It fit perfectly. Their shared ordeal, their struggle for justice, was now a permanent part of the history of his people, a memory that would be honored as long as the water flowed. The town continued to heal in small, awkward ways. The children, with their innocent and sometimes brutal honesty, were the first to bridge the remaining gaps. One afternoon, at the Bell House, as Abigail was reading a story aloud, a few of the children saw Nietzsche's walk past. Billy, the rancher's son with the defiant cowlick, cupped his hands around his mouth and shouted, "There goes the dress-mending hero." Little Hawk, the Apache boy, giggled, and soon all the children were laughing. Nietzsche stopped and looked at them, and, for the first time, Abigail saw a true, unguarded smile touch his lips. It transformed his stern face, making him look younger. Abigail put her hands on her hips in mock indignation. "You will show some respect," she said, her own voice full of laughter. "That man sews a line as straight as he shoots an arrow. It is a very useful skill." The wind began to change. The first sign of autumn coming to the high desert, the scorching heat of summer softened into a golden warmth. Hawks rode the high thermals, their sharp eyes scanning the vast, open land. The desert was still a harsh and demanding place. Its beauty was still a dangerous, sharp-edged thing. But as Abigail sat on the bench at her bell house, watching the children of the town, all of them, drinking from the same bucket, she felt a sense of peace settle over her. The loneliness that had been her constant companion since her arrival had begun to recede. The world still held its dangers and its sorrows, but it was no longer quite so solitary. The fragile peace that settled over Dust Haven was a convalescence. The town was a patient recovering from a high fever, weak and blinking in the clear light of a truth it had nearly refused to see. The bell house, with its simple bench and ever-full bucket of water, became a new center for the community, a quiet testament to a lesson learned in the hardest way. People spoke more softly to one another. The hard, suspicious glances had been replaced by a shared, if unspoken, sense of shame and a tentative desire for something better. But for Abigail, the peace was incomplete. Every sunset brought a fresh wave of anxiety. Every lone rider appearing on the horizon a surge of painful, fruitless hope. The mystery of Eli was a wound that would not close. The answer came, as answers in the desert often do, when it was least expected. It came in the form of a man stumbling out of the shimmering heat haze to the east, a scarecrow figure silhouetted against the morning sun. He was walking, or rather, shuffling, with the last of his strength. A deputy saw him first and rode out, thinking him a prospector lost and dying of thirst. When the deputy rode back, he was not alone. The man sat slumped in the saddle, and even beneath the layers of dust and sunburn and the ragged growth of a beard, Abigail knew him. She was on her feet before the horse had stopped, her heart a wild drum against her ribs. It was Eli. He was thin, his skin burned the color of old leather, and his eyes were sunk deep in his head. But they were his eyes, and they were alive. He slid from the horse and into her arms, his body trembling with exhaustion. They did not speak for a long time. She just held him, her face buried in his dusty, tattered shirt, the impossible, miraculous reality of his presence washing over her. He was solid, he was warm, he was alive. When she finally pulled back, her face was wet with tears she had not realized she was crying. She looked at him, at the brother she had been so certain was dead, and a smile broke through the tears, a smile of such profound relief it felt like the sun rising inside her. "I knew it. Brother," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "I knew it. The truth is only buried for a little while." His story, when he had the strength to tell it, was both simpler and more sinister than any of them had imagined. Pike had discovered that Eli had found the original survey maps for the pipeline, but Pike was not a killer by nature. He was a businessman, and Eli was a skilled engineer, instead of silencing him permanently in a shallow grave. Pike had seen an opportunity. He and a few of his hired men had taken Eli captive, moving him to a secret work camp deep in the hills where he was forcing Eli to oversee the most difficult parts of the pipeline's construction. He was a prisoner, isolated and watched day and night. The sandstorm, the same storm that had brought the town's crisis to a head, had been his salvation. In the chaos of the roaring wind and blinding dust, he had slipped away, running into the teeth of the gale. But he had not left empty-handed before he fled. He had taken a leather satchel from Pike's command tent, and inside it was the weapon they all needed, spread out on the sheriff's desk. Eli's stolen documents were a revelation. They were not just copies or notes. They were the originals. They were the official, signed blueprints for a vast network of pipelines, showing the sacred spring as only the first of a dozen water sources to be illegally tapped. There was a detailed ledger, far more damning than the one they had found at the reservoir, listing the names of territorial officials and the exact amounts they had been paid in bribes to approve the false permits. Pike's ambition had not been to supply a railroad. It had been to control every drop of water in the entire region, to hold a monopoly on life itself, which he could then sell at an exorbitant price to the very ranchers and farmers he had pretended to champion. The threat was no longer just to a small band of Chiricahua. It was a threat to every small rancher, every homesteader, every family who depended on the creeks and wells that Pike had planned to bleed dry. The enemy was no longer a shadowy savage. It was a man in a suit with a stack of legal papers. That evening, a different kind of meeting was held. Not a mob fueled by lies, but a council born of a shared threat. Sheriff Doyle had invited the elders from the Apache settlement, but he had also invited the small ranchers whose pastures were downstream from the other springs on Pike's map, and the Hispano farmers who irrigated their meager fields from the same sources. They gathered at the Bell House as twilight fell, a wary, mistrustful collection of old adversaries. It was Naiches who spoke, and his words were not of war, but of a new kind of survival. For many years, we have fought each other for this land, he said, his voice calm and steady, his gaze moving over the faces of the ranchers and farmers. You have seen us as enemies. We have seen you as invaders. Pike and Crow used that hatred. They knew that as long as we fought each other, we would never see the real thief. Today, we have a common enemy, an enemy who uses paper and ink as his weapons. We must learn to fight him in the same way. He proposed an alliance, a water council, made up of a representative from each community. Their purpose would not be to fight, but to watch, to keep a shared journal, a logbook of the water levels in the springs and creeks, to document every stranger who came into the valley, every survey marker that was planted. They would create their own set of facts, their own wall of paper, a truth so solid and so widely witnessed that no amount of money could bribe it away. They would use the white man's method of record-keeping to enforce a law that was older than any government, that water belongs to the land, and to all who live on it. There was a long silence as the men considered his words. Then, an old rancher, a man who had been one of the most vocal in his hatred of the Apache, cleared his throat. He is right, the rancher said, his voice gruff. Pike would have ruined me, same as he would have ruined anyone else. I do not have to like you, he said, looking at Naiches, to know that my cattle need water more than I need an old grudge. One by one, the others nodded. A new, fragile alliance was born. Not of friendship, but of a shared and vital interest. The next morning, a small procession left Dust Haven. It was led by Sheriff Doyle and Eli, who carried the satchel of evidence as if it were a holy relic. They were headed for the county seat to present their case to the territorial judge. Abigail went with them. Her written testimony, which she had spent all night preparing, was a masterpiece of clear, concise, and damning fact. She had taken the chaos and violence of the past weeks and rendered it into a calm, logical narrative that was more powerful than any emotional plea. Her clear, steady prose was the sharpest weapon they had. The night before they left, there was a quiet gathering around a fire at the edge of the Apache settlement. Eli was there, being treated as an honored guest, quietly answering the elders' questions about the land he had seen during his captivity. Abigail sat a little apart from the main group, watching the flames, her mind already on the difficult journey ahead. Naiches came and sat beside her. He did not speak, but simply offered her a piece of warm cornbread from a flat stone by the fire. She took it, and, for a moment, their fingers brushed. The small, accidental touch was more intimate than any embrace. It was a recognition of a bond that had been forged in pain and fear, and a shared, stubborn pursuit of the truth. They sat in a comfortable silence, the firelight playing on their faces, the quiet murmur of the council in the background. "When this is over," she said softly, not looking at him, "when the spring is at peace, and the water runs free for everyone, we will speak of us." He turned his head and looked at her, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight. "Yes," he said, his voice a low, certain thing. "We will." It was a promise, made in the quiet language of two people who had seen the worst of the world and had found the best in each other. As the riders prepared to leave the next morning, the whole town seemed to turn out. Reverend Michael stood on the steps of the church, his sermon that day having been a short but powerful one. We are a thirsty people. He had told his small congregation, we thirst for prosperity, for security, for justice. But we must remember that justice itself does not thirst. It is clear and pure. It is the people who grow thirsty, and in their thirst, they can be led to drink poison. As a final act of the town's transformation, Henderson, the livery owner and one of the Hispano farmers, climbed a ladder and hung a new bell. It was not the frantic, alarming bell of the post station, but a heavy, brass bell with a deep, resonant tone. They hung it over the community well in the center of town. As the procession for the county seat began to ride out, a gust of wind swept down the street, and the new bell rang out, a single, clear, hopeful note that seemed to hang in the crisp morning air like an oath. The territorial courthouse was a place of high, dry ceilings and the suffocating smell of old paper and stale tobacco. It was a world away from the open sky and red dust of the valley, a place where justice was measured not in honor but in stacks of notarized documents. The judge was a stern, hawk-nosed man who had seen every kind of liar the territory could produce, and he listened to the proceedings with a look of profound boredom. Barnaby Pike's expensive lawyers were slick and confident, drowning the courtroom in a flood of legal jargon about eminent domain, corporate charters, and the manifest destiny of progress. They presented their clients' permits, stamped and sealed, as an unassailable wall of legality. Then Eli took the stand, his voice quiet but steady. As he laid out the stolen blueprints, he explained the engineering, the calculated deception of the diversion, and the sheer scale of the intended theft. He was followed by Abigail. She did not speak with passion or outrage. She spoke as a teacher, presenting facts. She laid out the timeline of events, from the staged robbery to the discovery at the reservoir to Crow's final, desperate confession. Her testimony was a simple, sturdy narrative of truth, and it began to chip away at the lawyer's wall of paper. The final blow came when Sheriff Doyle presented the bribed officials' names from Pike's own ledger. The judge's boredom vanished, replaced by a flicker of cold, hard anger. He was a man who might tolerate greed, but he would not tolerate being made a fool of. The verdict, when it came, was swift and absolute. The railroad's water permits were declared fraudulent and were summarily revoked. All construction related to the pipeline was to be dismantled. The judge, looking down from his high bench, then dictated the terms of a new agreement, a community water accord, based on the principles Nietzsche's had laid out. It was a simple document, free of legal trickery. It recognized the sovereign rights of the Chiricahua to their sacred spring and established a council, with signed representatives from every community in the valley, to monitor and protect all shared water sources. As the Apache elders, the ranchers, and the farmers stepped forward to sign their names on the same page, a quiet, momentous history was made in the stuffy courtroom. Justice had been served, not just by the letter of the law, but by the will of the people who had to live with it. Sheriff Doyle served out the remainder of his term with a renewed sense of purpose. He was no longer just keeping a fragile peace. He was enforcing a just one. He oversaw the dismantling of Pike's illegal works and ensured that Judd Crow was transported to the territorial prison to serve a long sentence for his crimes. When his term was up, he did not run for re-election. He packed his few belongings, shook the hands of the new Water Council members, and rode west. He left behind a town that was stronger and more decent than the one he had found, and a new sheriff, a younger man who respected the law but respected the people it served even more. Abigail stayed. Dust Haven, the town she had come to with a single, desperate question, had become her home. The Bell House flourished under her care. The school grew, and the clamor of Anglo, Hispano, and Apache children learning their letters together became the new, hopeful sound of the town. Her small, open-air library became a central point of communication for the whole valley, and the water accord they had created, the simple document of shared stewardship, became a thing of quiet fame. Letters began to arrive at the Bell House from other valleys, other towns facing their own struggles with drought and greed, asking for a copy of the Dust Haven Accord, a blueprint for peace. Naiches became the man he was always meant to be, a bridge between two worlds. He was the Chiricahua representative on the Water Council, but his role grew far beyond that. He became a trusted mediator, a man whose word was his bond and whose understanding of the land was an invaluable resource to all. With a small team of his young men, he spent weeks marking the hidden springs and reliable water holes along the travelers' trails, erecting simple stone cairns that could be seen from a distance. The silent, watchful protector of one spring had become the public guardian of all of them. His presence, a quiet assurance that the days of theft and deception were over. Eli found his own way to heal the land his former employers had tried to scar. He turned down a lucrative offer to work as a chief engineer on another section of the railroad. Instead, he gathered a small crew of men who had been left jobless by Pike's downfall. With mules and shovels, not dynamite and tar, they began the slow work of repairing the damage. They filled in the ditches, stabilized the land that had been cleared for the pipeline, and rebuilt the natural channels that fed the smaller creeks. It was hard, slow, anonymous work. But for Eli, it was a penance and a purpose. He was not building an empire of iron. He was mending a small piece of the earth, one shovelful of dirt at a time. The seasons turned, and a year passed. One hot afternoon in late summer, the post station bell rang its familiar, cheerful tone, announcing the arrival of the weekly stagecoach, a family of homesteaders, their faces etched with the weariness of a long journey, climbed down from the coach. They were covered in dust, their lips cracked, their eyes scanning the strange, new town with a mixture of hope and apprehension. Before they could even ask, Abigail was walking toward them from the Bell House, a full dipper of cool water in her hand. She offered it to the mother, who drank deeply and then passed it to her children. "Welcome to Dust Haven," Abigail said, her smile easy and genuine. Naiches, who had been speaking with Henderson at the livery, walked over and stood beside her. He looked up at the sky, at a gathering of dark, bruised-looking clouds building over the distant mountains. "There will be rain before nightfall," he said, not as a prediction, but as a simple statement of fact. The homesteaders looked from the woman offering water to the man who could read the sky, and the apprehension in their faces began to soften into relief. They had arrived. They were safe. As the family moved toward the general store, Abigail's gaze fell to her dress. The sturdy wool skirt still bore the scar from her encounter with the cholla cactus. The long, mended tear a faint, pale line, and at the bottom, covering the place where the fabric had been torn away, was the soft, gray patch of deerskin Naiches had given her. Her stitches attaching it were neat, but his leather was what gave it its strength. She ran her fingers over it. The patch was beautiful, she thought, not because of the skill of the stitch, but because of who had held it up. It was a testament not to the wound, but to the healing, a symbol of a rescue that had saved more than just her life. It had saved a town. It had saved a future. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of distant rain and the promise of a cooler evening. The new bell over the town well stirred, letting out a single, low, contented tone. It was the sound of a promise kept, of a hard-won peace settling over the land. Here, in this small, dusty corner of the world, hatred had been ended not with violence, but with a stubborn courage. A family had been forged, not by blood, but by the shared choice to care for one another. And justice, clear and life-giving, was finally drinking from the same cup as the people. Thank you for listening to our story. We would love to hear where you are tuning in from in the comments below, so we can all connect and share our thoughts. Please subscribe to our channel Wild West Tales, like this video, and show your support by hitting the hype button to help this story reach more listeners.